Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Lindner. Welcome. We're going to be looking at the respiratory tract in this video. And why don't we start with a simple concept? What I'd like to talk about is just the critical thinking part as to why do we have a respiratory tract? Why do we need to breathe? And I thought that this picture explains it pretty well. So if you look on the left-hand side, we have this young individual, looks like they're taking in oxygen represented by this blue arrow. So they're breathing in this oxygen, it's going into the lungs, and the purpose of getting that oxygen into the lungs is eventually that oxygenated blood will find its way into the heart, to the left side of the heart, eventually the left atrium, left ventricle. The left ventricle will find a way of pumping this blood to all the body parts and the cells of the human body. And we need that oxygen to be delivered into the cell. Now, if you think back to the cell, we have the nucleus, we have the cytosol, the cytoplasm, we have all these organelles. And one of the infamous organelles is the mitochondria. And if we think of the mitochondria, it has typically earned its name, the powerhouse of the cell. What do we mean by the powerhouse of the cell? Is that the mitochondria has the ability of creating ATP, the energy currency of the body, adenosine triphosphate. And if you look at the top where it says cellular respiration, we have glucose plus 6 oxygens. When you have the oxygen interacting with the glucose, C6H12O6, it's going to yield 6 waters, 36 ATP, and 6 CO2. So what happens to the CO2, the carbon dioxide, is that we are going to use that 6 CO2 that we see right over here, and that's going to be exhaled as carbon dioxide. Okay, so we're breathing in, inhalation, exhalation, but we also have cellular respiration where we're taking in that oxygen, giving off this carbon dioxide, which is what we give off. And we can see here as well that we take in the nutrients, the carbohydrates, the proteins, the fats, blah, 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 right? So we've got the glucose coming in. The glucose is broken down. Glycolysis or glycolysis is when we take that 6 carbon sugar and we break it down into 2 3-carbon sugars. Now we have pyruvate or pyruvic acid. And in the presence of oxygen, that's the key, in the presence of oxygen, that pyruvate can enter the mitochondria. Okay, it's converted to acetyl-CoA, and eventually that will be utilized by the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle is very dependent on our B vitamins, especially B1, B2, and B3. And the Krebs cycle, the byproduct of the Krebs cycle is going to be CO2, carbon dioxide that we give off, and it's going to be making these coenzymes, and these coenzymes are going to be utilized by the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain is what's going to produce the majority of the ATP. The electron transport chain is needing these coenzymes. The electron transport chain is very much dependent on iron, and it's very much dependent on coenzyme Q10, very much dependent on that. Okay, so well, if we don't have oxygen, in the absence of oxygen, then pyruvate is then converted to lactic acid. Okay, the lactic acid can go into the blood, it can go to the liver, where it is converted back with some rest and some time and chance to get our oxygen levels back up. It can be converted back into pyruvate. Okay, They call that the Cori cycle. Cori cycle. Okay, so there's just a little basic understanding as to why respiration is so important, why we need oxygen, really for the primary purpose of creating ATP or energy. What I'd like to do here is just to give you a little bit of an understanding of some of the basic parts of the respiratory tract. So you can always use this as a go-to if you need to review some of the basic anatomy. So, okay, here is the nose. We are breathing air in, and inside the nose, in this nasal cavity, we have certain structures in there that are called turbinates or concha, and those turbinates are going to filter the air, it's going to warm the air, and it's going to moisten the air that we breathe in. And we'll show you these turbinates in a little bit more detail in a upcoming picture. We have the mouth, which is the passageway for food and oxygen. Here's the tongue. Underneath the tongue, we do have some glands. Then we move back to the throat, and the throat is the pharynx. When it's behind the nose right here, we would call that the nasopharynx. When it's behind the mouth, we would call it the oropharynx. And when it's near the throat, we call it the laryngopharynx. So here's the larynx. The larynx is involved in producing sound. We would call it the voice box, where we have true and false vocal folds. Then we have this cartilage right here called epiglottis. It's pretty elastic. And the purpose of the epiglottis is that when you're swallowing food, we don't want food going down the windpipe. So this really neatly folds downward and covers the trachea. When food goes down, it's like a reflex. This epiglottis closes off so water and food can't go down the windpipe, and it gets diverted down the esophagus. That makes sense. Here's the trachea. That's the main airway or the windpipe. And there's lots of cartilage that wraps around the trachea as well. Here are the lungs. That's the organ where the gas exchange takes place. Around the lungs, we have these pleural membranes. There is a parietal pleura, and there is a visceral pleura, and between the two is the pleural cavity. Around the lungs, we have muscles, these intercostal muscles. There's internal and external intercostal, which is involved in moving the ribs during inhalation and exhalation. Deep in the lungs, after the trachea, we have our primary bronchi, and inside the lungs, we have many branches of those primary bronchi. We'll have secondary bronchi and tertiary bronchi and even terminal bronchi. And way, way at the very, very end where the gas exchange takes place, we have the alveoli. And those are known as the air sacs. That's where the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide take place. We have the ribs, 12 pairs of ribs that are involved in protecting the lungs as well. And then we have this skeletal muscle right here called the diaphragm, which is also involved in respiration. The diaphragm, when it pulls down, when it pulls downward, it will allow air, it'll allow inhalation. And when the diaphragm relaxes and it pushes upward, it forces the air out for exhalation. So during contraction, it drops, allowing us to inhale. And then the diaphragm relaxes and it just pushes up and forces the air out in exhalation. Okay, so those are just a few of the moving parts. We could then organize the respiratory system and break it down both structurally And functionally, when we look at it from a structural standpoint, we can divide it into an upper and lower respiratory tract. And we've heard of people that say, oh, they're not feeling well and they have an upper respiratory tract infection or they have a lower respiratory tract infection. More recently, trying to make this kind of relevant for us, we've heard of COVID and certain strains affecting and targeting the lower respiratory tract. That was the earlier on Delta variants that were very, very deep. And then there were more recent variants, not as serious, affecting the upper respiratory tract, where people were saying it was just up here, up in the nose. Okay, and then in terms of functional classification, we could divide it into a conducting zone and a respiratory zone. Okay, when you think of the respiratory zone, I want you to think of the gas exchange, the alveoli, where oxygen and CO2 more at that capillary level where that exchange takes place. So here in the upper respiratory tract, which is everything above the larynx or the voice box, and lower respiratory is below the larynx. Everything above the larynx, we're talking about the nose and the nasal cavity, your sinuses and pharynx. And the primary function there is to filter the air and warm the air and humidify the incoming air. The lower respiratory system, which is below the larynx, is going to consist of the larynx, which is the voice box, the trachea, your windpipe. And as we move down, we have bronchi, bronchioles, and the alveoli, which is where the gas exchange will take place. So trying to put more of a visual to this, right here is the nose. So air is going to come in here that we inhale. And you can see we have these concha. These are also known as turbinates. There is an inferior turbinate, a middle turbinate, and a superior turbinate, also known as an inferior, middle, and superior concha. And it's going to act as like a centrifuge. As air comes in, it's going to spin and centrifuge the air. And it will make a little bit more of visual sense when you look at it from a different view. Looking at it heads on, it does look like a spiral or a centrifuge. But from this view, it's a little bit tough. But it does spin, moisten, and warm and filter the air as air is breathed in. We can see one of our sinuses here, our frontal sinus. And from this view, we can see a sphenoid sinus. From our other view, we'll be able to see the maxillary sinus. Okay, when we take a good look at the maxilla. Okay, what else do we have? Let's see. We have our tongue over here. Back here is the pharynx. And again, with the pharynx, we said there is a nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. Everything from this dotted line right here going up, upward in this direction, that's the upper respiratory tract. And again, everything from this line going down in this direction, this would be the lower respiratory tract. Upper respiratory tract infections involve everything up here, and lower respiratory tract infections involve everything down here. So here is our trachea. And then we have our bronchus. You have your right bronchus and left bronchus. And then we have deeper, we have bronchioles. The right primary bronchus is a little bit more vertical, and it's also wider in diameter, which makes a lot of aspiration injuries with babies and infants targeting the right lung, right? If a baby inhales a quarter or swallows a penny or inhales a marble or something, it's more likely to be found in that right primary bronchus because it's more vertical and wider in diameter. Again, here's a nice picture showing the nasal vestibule, the external nares, right? The nostril. We now have our inferior, middle, and superior concha. also referred to as the inferior, middle, and superior turbinates. Here is the frontal sinus. Here is the nasal cavity. We have our external nares here, and we have our internal nares back here, close to the nasopharynx. So when you look at pharynx, right here, you could see the three different flavors: nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. When it's behind the nose, nasopharynx. When it's behind the mouth, oropharynx. And it's behind the larynx, laryngopharynx. Here is the very important epiglottis, which folds down, right? It'll fold down like this, closing off the airway, diverting food and making sure that food goes down the esophagus, which we see here. Now the larynx, we'll look at it in a separate picture, but we have a glottis. There's an epiglottis, epi's above, then there's a glottis, and then we have vocal folds. Vocal folds are involved in speech. Okay, everything blue or sky blue is cartilage. So the epiglottis is cartilage. Then we have the thyroid cartilage. Then we have the cricoid cartilage. Cricoid means ring. So if you look at the cricoid cartilage right here, you could see it in the anterior and you could see it in the posterior. It actually wraps around the entire thing. It makes a ring. It's called a cricoid cartilage, whereas the thyroid cartilage really just wraps around the front and around the lateral side. It doesn't go all the way around and make a complete ring, which is why we don't see it on the posterior side. Okay, and don't confuse the thyroid gland with the thyroid cartilage. They're two different structures. Now, from a functional, right, that was that structural classification where you have the upper respiratory and lower respiratory tract. From a functional perspective, we have a conducting zone, and then we have a respiratory zone. The conducting zone involves the trachea, then you have your main bronchi, then they divide into lobar and segmental bronchi. And you can tell there's like 2 to 10 of them, right? Tells you about how many. Then there's bronchioles, which end at the terminal bronchioles. And at the end, or at the terminal bronchioles, that's really where the conducting zone ends. Now we're into the respiratory zone, which starts with the respiratory bronchioles. Then we have our alveolar ducts, and then the alveolar sacs. Okay, so this is the part that's involved at where we want the oxygen and the CO2 exchange to take place. We need the respiratory zone for that. Okay. This is a nice picture just showing the pharynx. Behind the nose is the nasopharynx. Behind the mouth is the oropharynx. And then behind the larynx is the laryngopharynx. And then here we can see the inferior, middle, and superior turbinates or concha. And then between, I'll put an M, these are all meatises. Meatises are like the grooves or the sulci or the valleys. So you have an inferior, middle, and superior meatus, as well as having an inferior, middle, and superior concha or turbinate. The pharynx is essentially the part that we refer to as the throat. And the pharynx is going to allow for the drainage of the structures of the skull. And it's going to allow for the air pressure equalization in the skull. In the nasopharynx, there is a portion that we call the eustachian tube that's named after Bartolomeo Eustachi, right? This is what happens when you fly in high altitudes and you feel that awkward sense in the ears and you try and pop your ears or yawn or chew gum to try and equalize the pressure of what's outside and inside the ear. That's the eustachian tube. Let's see if I could show. That would be right here behind the nasopharynx. Okay, let's see if I could show it in another one. That would be right here. They call it the entrance to the auditory tube, which is the eustachian tube as well. Okay, and it allows for speech. The laryngopharynx or larynx is involved. The nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx are really the three main parts that I had just pointed out before. The nasopharynx is the area of the pharynx in which the nose drains. We have the eustachian tube or the auditory tube of the ear that communicates with the nasopharynx. And then we have the oropharynx, which drains into the mouth. And then laryngopharynx that contains the voice box. Let me show you why the nasopharynx is an important area. We're going to show some connections of the eye in there in terms of the tears. So let's just show you here. We have the lacrimal gland. Lacrimation means tearing. And what's going to happen is the tears are going to go from that superior lateral into the inferior medial portion, and then it's going to drain into these canals, the lacrimal canals, whether it be the superior or the inferior lacrimal canal, will find its way into the lacrimal sac, and then those tears are going to move on in, down in here, right into the nose, into that inferior nasal concha. We have the turbinates and the meatuses. And remember, tears are not very clean fluid. They're actually dirty because it's cleaning out everything that the eyes are exposed to. So with all that debris coming in, there's going to be a histamine reaction in the nose, and all the concha and turbinates are going to swell. And when they get inflamed and they swell, then you sound like this. And you sound all nasally. Now, let's look at the ear as well, because the ear is connected to the nasopharynx, right? This is the eustachian tube or the auditory tube. And right here is the tympanic membrane. And this is what alters when you want to pop your ears by holding your nose and pushing. You're changing or inverting and everting the membrane to try and equalize the pressure outside compared to inside. So here is the helix or the auricle of the ear, and you have sound waves that are coming in, bouncing off through the external auditory meatus or canal. It hits the tympanic membrane. It's going to vibrate into the three small bones of the ear, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. It's going to attach through this oval window, the stapes in the oval window, and it's really going to oscillate and vibrate everything inside the cochlea, right? So it's taking these sound waves and it's going to convert it into the sensory receptors of the ear, and it's going to relay that to the vestibulocochlear nerve, but the hearing portion is the cochlear branch. The vestibular branch deals with balance, the cochlear branch deals with hearing. So when people have a cochlear implant, it's really for the hearing. When people have balance issues, it involves the semicircular canals. That's when they have like a benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, when they look back or they turn their head and their eyes go into nystagmus and everything's spinning. One of the crystals is lodged in one of these semicircular canals. Okay, let's see what else we have here. This is just a larger version of showing the eardrum or the tympanic membrane, the malleus, the incus, and once again, the stapes. You can see the cochlear here. Here is the auditory tube or the eustachian tube. This is the external auditory meatus out here. This is what we call the middle ear. Okay. And we can actually take a look at this to see if there is inflammation of the middle ear or the eardrum. Let's take a look. So otitis media, that is the medical term that's describing an ear infection or middle ear infection. And it's typically caused by some sort of bacteria or a virus. And there are some biomechanical causes of this. In young children, the tubes inside of their ears are more horizontal, okay? And we want them to be more vertical. But if they're more horizontal, then you can get a stagnation of the fluid inside the ear. This becomes a problem when they're horizontal because when parents are bottle feeding a baby in the supine position, a lot of the fluids can stagnate in the middle ear and not drop. So when you get the stagnation of bacteria inside the ear, you can get these microorganisms that can cause ear infections. And that's why it's not the best to bottle feed a baby, if not breastfeeding, bottle feeding a baby with the baby horizontal. It should be upright. And instead of tilting the baby, you tilt the bottle. That's why a lot of the bottles today look like hockey sticks. Otitis media can also be caused by toxins that's found in smoke and allergens, and it can irritate the mucous membranes of the respiratory system, and it just does increase the risk of ear infections, as does dairy foods. There could be issues with forced air heating systems that can dry out the mucous membranes within the respiratory system, and that can also promote the growth of mold and allergens. So here's what, if we take a otoscope, right? It's kind of like a fundoscope, what we use to look in the eye, but you change the tip and put in an otoscope. This should look nice and pearly and white and tight. Now, when I look in and I see this, that is an inflamed red tympanic membrane. This is fluid infiltration, fluid inside the middle ear. And this is when someone pokes a Q-tip in and they go too far and they perforate the tympanic membrane. Extremely, extremely painful stuff. So what are the complications of otitis media? The middle air should normally have a little bit of air in there. When fluid exists in the middle ear, the tympanic membrane is unable to oscillate back and forth and pump the fluid inside of the cochlear apparatus effectively. Now, if this occurs, it can result in a hearing issue, and it can also result in speech disorders. And the mastoid process, the mastoid bone, which is behind the ear near the skull, there are these mastoid air cells that help the middle ear regulate pressure and volume of air. And every now and then, when there is a middle ear infection, it can spread into the mastoid air cells and it can cause mastoiditis. And this could be a real problem. So whenever babies are tugging on the ear, it can happen with teething, but I always take my fingers with babies and push behind the ear right on the bone. That should not be painful, but if the baby is pulling away or it's hot and inflamed, then it's most likely mastoiditis, and that becomes more of a medical emergency. Okay, we'll take a break here. When I come back, we'll look at the sinuses.